So if you look at your bulletin, you won't find a passage or anything because I wasn't able to give one before. But today we are actually going to be reading out of Joshua 6, verses 1 through 20. I like long passages. They give context. Just be happy I didn't read the entire first 5 chapters. When you have it, say amen. There we go. I'll let you go. You're nursing a child. I'll let that slide. Joshua 6, chapter 6, verses 1 through 20. All right, there we go. All right. My version might be a little different from yours. If you're using the Pew Bible, that's all right. Now Jericho was strongly fortified because of the Israelites, no one leaving or entering. The Lord said to Joshua, Look, I have handed Jericho, its king and its fighting men over to you. March around the city with all the men of war, circling the city 1 time. Do this for 6 days. Have 7 priests carry 7 ram's horn trumpets in the front of the ark. But on the 7th day, march around the city 7 times, while the priests blow the trumpets. When there is a prolonged blast of the horn, you will hear its sound. Have all the people give a mighty shout. Then the city wall will fall, and the people will advance, each man straight ahead. Joshua, son of Nun, summoned the priests and said to them, Take up the ark of the covenant, and have 7 priests carry 7 trumpets in front of the ark of the Lord. He said to the people, Move forward, march around the city, and have the armed troops go ahead of the ark of the Lord. After Joshua had spoken to the people, 7 priests carrying 7 trumpets before the Lord moved forward and blew the trumpets. The ark of the Lord's covenant followed them. When the trumpets were blowing, the armed troops went in front of the priests who blew the trumpets, and the rear guard went behind the ark. But Joshua had commanded the people, Do not shout or let your voice be heard. Don't let one word come out of your mouth until the time I say shout. Then you are to shout. So the ark of the Lord was carried around the city, circling it once. They returned to the camp and spent the night there. Joshua got up early the next morning. The priests took the ark of the Lord, and the 7 priests carrying the 7 trumpets marched in front of the ark of the Lord. While the trumpets were blowing, the armed troops were in front of them, and the rear guard went behind the ark of the Lord. On the 2nd day, they marched around the city once and returned to the camp. They did this for 6 days. Early on the 7th day, they started at dawn and marched around the city 7 times in the same way. That was the only day they marched around the city 7 times. After the 7th time, the priests blew the trumpets, and Joshua said to the people, Shout, for the Lord has given you the city. But the city and everything in it are set apart to the Lord for destruction. Only Rahab, the prostitute, and everyone with her in the house will live, because she hid the men we sent. But keep yourselves from the things set apart, or you will be set apart for destruction. If you take any of those things, you will tear apart the city of Israel for destruction, the camp of Israel for destruction, and bring disaster on it. For all the silver and gold and the articles of bronze and iron are dedicated to the Lord and must go into the Lord's treasury. So the people shouted, and the trumpets sounded. When they heard the blast of the trumpet, the people gave a great shout. The wall collapsed. The people advanced into the city, each man straight ahead, and they captured the city. Now, I'm continuing the theme Mike has had going on this past summer with heroes from the Bible, usually ones that we've remembered being told in our Sunday school lessons. There are 2 main stories of Joshua people usually remember. The first is the walls of Jericho. The second is Joshua going in, being a spy into the land of Israel 40 years before this. And I want to remember those 2 stories because they deal a lot with each other. So if you know me, you know I like context. So here we go. The first is with Joshua. Who is Joshua, son of Nun? We usually make that little joke on Father's Day. Who is the one man without a father? Joshua, son of Nun. Oh, yes. Yes. Very amusing. But Joshua, who is he? This random guy pulled from the army? No, he was actually a servant of Moses for a long portion of his life. Moses had Joshua as one of his servants, and multiple times Joshua would remain with Moses as Moses was conferring, or he'd remain in the area of Moses while he conferred with the Lord. Moses picked 12 men to go into Israel and spy out the land 40 years before this time and see how they were going to conquer it. How was the land producing? Who were the inhabitants of the land? That kind of thing. Joshua was one of the 12. When they came back, Joshua was one of only 2 men that did not tell stories of giants and that they won't be able to take the land. It's just, you're not going to do it. We're going to go to our death if we go there. Because of this, Joshua is one of only 2 men of that generation that have survived to this point. Because of Israel's reluctance to go into the land and take it, because they didn't believe that God had actually given it to them. Joshua and his partner are both saying, no, we can do it. If the Lord is with us and the Lord has given this to us, then we can take it. But the majority of the tribes of Israel don't agree. They're too afraid. And because of this, 40 years are spent in the desert. Every person of that generation, 20 and older, die and are not able to enter into the promised land that was given them. I asked Keel this question the other day for 2 reasons. One, I wanted to know the reason, and 2, I knew it would intrigue him enough to make sure he was here. I asked him, when do you learn to march at boot camp? When do you learn that? Because I don't think you're going to be marching much on the battlefield. So when do you actually learn to march? Is it one of the first things? Is it one of the last things? He tells me it's one of the first things you learn. You practice it, I think it was 8 hours a day, for 92 days. Like, that is something you learn and it stays with you. That was Keel's boot camp. Israel's boot camp is similar. They are taught the first lesson is to rely on God. They are spent 40 years in the desert. The only food they have is that which is given to them by God every day. They are taught to rely completely on the Lord from day one for 40 years, not just 92. Not 92 days, 40 years. So, Joshua's one of these 2 that get to live and continue. But if all he was is a spy, that would be the end of our story. But Joshua is seen by God as a man with the spirit of leadership. We can see this in Numbers 27:18. There's a good reason to read Numbers sometimes. I know it's a book people don't like reading, but there are good things in it. So we see in Numbers 27:18 that God says, give Joshua authority over the people of Israel, because he has a spirit of leadership in him. Joshua is a leader. He's also a military man. In these 40 years, they're not alone. They actually go to war a few times with other small kingdoms. Shion and Og are 2 cities that they capture. Both armies come out to them, meet them in battle. Joshua fights with them, and they take the cities. This is Joshua's experience with battle. Meeting the enemy head on, fighting them in the open, and then going to conquer the city when most of the army has been destroyed. But now Moses has died. Moses has died, and they've crossed the river Jordan. And the first thing they see after 40 years is a city of walls. Now, if you've been to Israel, you might have been to Jericho. It sprawls everywhere. It's huge. It's not what it was in that day. Some commentators think that the city was more like a small town, And then there's others that say, no, it was actually a rather large town. It'd be more like Carlisle if it was pushed together more with giant walls. There's arguments of what it was like at that time. So we just have our text saying that it's a walled city. Now, as we've read, it says that the city is terrified, the city is fortified. If you've read the other chapters, you would learn that the kingdoms of Israel that are in Israel right now are terrified of the Israelites because they've heard what happened to Egypt, which was the big cat kingdom in that time. These are the little mice they're dealing with now. That's the big cat in the area. You don't deal with Egypt. You just do what Egypt tells you. But all these slaves from Egypt were taken from them by this deity that sent plagues on them. Then these ex-slaves took 2 cities. How are they surviving in the desert? They've been there for 40 years. The cities are terrified, and now they've crossed the River Jordan, but they didn't do it in boats. They didn't wade through the water. The water parted for them. This is something else people in Jericho are probably whispering to each other, having seen it from their fields, saying, the water's parted. We can't stop them. We're not going to go out to fight them. They'll destroy us like they did the other 2 cities. So they're fortified, so they're holding up in their walls. This is something Joshua hasn't encountered yet. He doesn't know how to siege a city. Now, something else about Jericho, which I find it very important to understand, is Jericho has a 12-month-long harvest season. All year long, they can collect food. They have storehouses of food. They will be fine. There are 3 springs or wells in Jericho. One's gushing out 1,000 gallons a minute. They don't need water. They've got enough. To hold a siege against this city, if you've ever seen an old movie of medieval, concepts of fighting, you'll see sieges. The idea is you are on the outside, you can hold out as long as your enemy on the inside can hold out. The people on the inside, if they don't have water or food, they will give up quickly. Jericho has plenty of both. And they are protected by their walls. There's no reason for them to come out. Joshua, on the other hand, has fighting men who he needs to feed, he needs to water, he needs to keep their morale up. He doesn't know what to do. He's never gone up against a walled city like this. And he's in enemy territory. You don't know if one of the other kingdoms is going to come and support Jericho. And then you'll be fighting multiple armies. Time is precious. What would you do? How many of us have ever had a job where we knew what project we had to finish? We knew what the project had to look like. We knew what the information had to tell. But you just didn't know the first step. How many of us getting out of high school or college got the dream job right away? I know I didn't. I had to take the first step, which was get any job. But you don't always know what it's going to look like. You don't know what the next step is. It's terrifying. I can tell you personally, writing papers terrifies me. I know what I want to tell my professor. I know what it has to say and how it can sound nice. The introductions are killer. You can ask Annie. I spend hours on the introduction sentence alone. And only once does that get started can I start flowing my paper together. The first step is sometimes the hardest. And I don't think it's a coincidence that God gave them this city to be the first one. Because what it does is reinstate that first lesson they learned in the desert. Don't rely on your strategic knowledge. Don't rely on clever distractions. Don't rely on that stuff. Rely on me. And what he has them do is one of the first lessons Keel learned. March. You're just going to march. To destroy those walls, you will walk around a city once a day for 6 days. On the seventh day, you'll do it 7 times. This seems weird. If I had to give a label for Joshua as a hero, I would say he's a faithful hero. He holds his faith when the others are saying that the giants are too much, they can't take them, we should not take the land. And he holds his faith when God gives him this message, where you're going to walk around with the fighting men, you're not going to say anything, you're not going to shout insults, you won't try to intimidate, you're just going to walk around, and you're going to make sure that the covenant is in the middle of it. Before, you'll be marching some of your men, and before that, and after that will be priests, blowing ram's horns. We have one up here. Have you ever noticed it? It is called a shofar. This one is very nice. It is laid with silver. They're not always this nice. This is a ram's horn trumpet. I'm not going to blow it. I don't know how to blow it properly. That's why I won't do it. But it makes a loud sound. This is the kind of horn that the priests are carrying and the blowing. The other time we see this horn, trumpet, is in the temple. Blowing this is a call to worship. Blowing this is telling people, now is the time you do your sacrifices. Now is the time to come to God and worship. I don't think it's a coincidence. I don't think it's a coincidence that God has them carrying around a horn that indicates the time of worship. God's reminding them not only that is God in the center of this formation, His throne is in the center of it, but the horns are calling these people to worship. Do the walls fall when the horns sound? No. What do they have to do? The Israelites have to respond to this call. The Israelites shout at the very end, and that is when the walls fall. I love that. I love the symbolism there. It is God saying, I will be calling you to worship. And now it will be a great thing. But the walls, your troubles, those things that are impeding your life, that you see are walled cities that you can't conquer, respond to God's call, and then He will conquer them. I call Joshua the faithful servant, the faithful hero. After this story, we'll see Joshua take the north and the south of Israel in strategic moves that he does, and it's brilliant. I would encourage you to read them. They're very smart moves. You can see the land through his eyes. But this is the first part. Joshua knew he was supposed to take the land and take it possession for Israel. Moses had told him this in the first chapter, I believe, of Deuteronomy, and in the 31st chapter of Deuteronomy, and in the third. He has told this numerous times. He has given that vision of, you're going to do this. You will conquer the land and reclaim it for the people of Israel, the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. But it didn't tell him, first you're going to defeat Jericho by relying on God. He just trusted in the first vision he got. And then he trusted in the second one God gave him, which was how to do it. God was giving him marching orders. And I'm sure, and the interesting thing is, Joshua is not the only one who is faithful in this story. We always remember him. But it's all the fighting men were faithful to this vision. All the fighting men were faithful to God, which they weren't 40 years before. So, this week, listen for your marching orders. How can you be faithful to God? If you were with us in Sunday school, you heard me talk about forgiveness. Those are part of our marching orders. Christ gives us His marching order in Matthew 28. It's called the Great Commission. We are to go and make followers of all nations. He gives us the first step to this, though. For he is telling this to his men in Jerusalem. And he says, make followers in Jerusalem, and Israel, Samaria, and into the ends of the earth. He gives us the rippling effect that we are to follow. First, make followers and faithful followers in your homes, which starts with yourself. Joshua is a faithful follower. Even if God's lessons, even if God's words don't always make sense to us, it might be get that job that is low paying, they don't appreciate you. But if you work at that job and you reflect me, you reflect Christ, you can turn lives around. We don't always see the first step, and we don't always see the final step. But we have to be faithful to whatever God gives us and follow it as best as we can. Lord, I come to you not knowing the next step. I come to you scared of what the next step might be. Lord, you know the people and you know the hearts in this congregation. You know their next step, and you know their final step. Help them and help me see these steps this week and see you in them. Help us see where you want us to go, who you want us to talk to. Soften our hearts that we can hear you accurately and that you can tell us in ways that we can understand. Abba, Father, we need you desperately in this time. Amen.